With this lecture, the focus of the discussion shifts. We have been discussing microeconomics, three groups of markets: markets for goods, labor, and capital. Now what we want to do is look more closely at a variety of topics in microeconomics, many of which have implications for public policy. This lecture and the two that follow are on the subject of competition between firms. This lecture focuses on the task of classification. That is, how do economists classify the main types of competition between firms, and what are the characteristics of each type of competition? The next lecture then focuses on antitrust, which is the set of public policies to ensure that firms don't combine together to act like a monopoly or to restrict competition. The following lecture then focuses on the economics of regulated industries, including examples of deregulation like the airline industry, and some current controversial issues like how to regulate the telecommunications industry or the electricity industry. This discussion of competition between firms begins with the basic insight that profit-seeking and self-interest are powerful forces, which from the point of view of society could go in opposite directions. One direction might be that profit-seeking could pressure firms to produce innovative products with high quality and low cost so they can sell lots of them and make money in that way. However, it's also possible that profit-seeking could encourage firms to collude with each other, to get together with their competitors, to raise prices, to lie about quality, to mislead consumers, to pollute, and to create all sorts of social problems. The famous Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto once said, "The efforts of men are utilized in two different ways. They are directed to the production or transformation of economic goods, or else to the appropriation of goods produced by others." The government has a role to play in setting up a framework of law and regulation, which encourages this elemental force of competition and profit-seeking to be focused on the socially productive results and away from what we might call the dark side of the force. Let's start off by talking about the range of firms in the U.S. economy, from small single-person operations up to enormous corporations. There are three broad types of firm ownership. There are proprietorships, which are owned by an individual. There are partnerships, which are owned by a group of partners. And there are corporations, which are standalone organizations run by an ownership made up of shareholders, but also in some cases owned privately. Early in the 2000s, there were about 18 million proprietorships in the U.S. economy, that is, businesses owned by an individual. There were about 2 million partnerships, businesses owned by a partnership, and about 5 million corporations, which were incorporated as a legal entity and a standalone legal entity. A corporation could be publicly owned by shareholders, it can be privately owned by a large group as well. But corporations, even though they're not the biggest group numerically, dominate in size. The 5 million corporations had about $20 trillion in receipts. Think sales in terms of receipts. $20 trillion in sales. The 2 million partnerships had only about $2.5 trillion in sales, and the 18 million proprietorships combined had a total of about $1 trillion in sales or receipts. The range of industries across the U.S. economy is truly extraordinary. If you go through the government statistics, some of the main headings include agriculture, mining, utilities, construction, manufacturing, which of course includes a lot of stuff, retail, transportation, telecommunications, broadcasting, finance, real estate, professional and technical services, waste management, education, healthcare, arts, entertainment, accommodations, food service, auto repair, laundry services. The economy is this extraordinary range of production. There's also a sense sometimes that because of the sales of big corporations, almost everybody works at a really big company. That's not quite actually true, although there's some truth in it. If you look at a graph that shows where people work according to the size of their firm, What you find is that firms that have 500 or more employees employ roughly half of the labor force. But that means that firms with 500 or less employees would employ also about half the labor force. In particular, firms with 20 or fewer employees employ about 1/5 of all workers. So an awful lot of workers do work at firms which are relatively small. Not everyone is working for some giant company that everyone has heard of. In any given year, firms are starting and ending. In any given year, about 500,000 businesses start and about 500,000 businesses die. As you might expect, most of these business firms and births and deaths are small firms, but several hundred of the startups that occur each year have more than 500 employees. So big companies do start and die as well. All of these industries, all of these firms, all of these different kinds of companies across the economy can involve one of 4 different types of competition. And you can think of these 4 types of competition as sort of being along a spectrum of competition, from perfect competition at one end to monopolistic competition to oligopoly to monopoly. Now, obviously, there are a lot of terms there. We need to come back and unpack those one at a time. But we can think of these as 4 sort of prototypical different types of competition. Let me quickly sketch what they are, and then we'll talk about each one in more detail. Perfect competition refers to when there are many, many small firms making nearly identical products, and they all have to look at the price in the market and just accept it. They have to be price takers in their market because they're too small to be anything else. At the extreme opposite end of the range of competition would be monopoly. Monopoly is when there's one single seller that has all or most of the sales in a given market. Then in between those 2 extremes of many small firms, perfect competition, and one big firm are 2 intermediate categories. Monopolistic competition is when there are many firms and they compete by selling products that are somewhat different. You can think of, for example, firms that sell different styles of clothing or restaurants that sell different styles of food. An oligopoly is somewhat like a monopoly, except instead of having one firm that has all or almost all the sales, an oligopoly is when a small number of firms, and small number is deliberately imprecise, but it might be, for example, between 2 and 4 firms, have most or all of the sales revenues in a given market. Now, this range will cover essentially all of the competitive patterns that emerge commonly from profit-seeking firms. It'll really cover pretty much all the ground. So when we think about how different forms of competition work, when we think about the benefits and the trade-offs of different kinds of competition, we can walk through those different trade-offs about competition by thinking about these 4 different categories and how each of them is likely to operate. So let's start off first by thinking about the category of perfect competition. What is perfect competition exactly? It's going to be when small firms are making identical products, and thus, when they're making identical products, they have to act as price takers in their market. Price takers just means they have to accept the market price. A common example that's used about perfectly competitive producers is to think about farmers. Many, many small farmers, and they're growing wheat or they're growing corn. Now, of course, with many big agribusiness companies around these days, this may be a rather dated notion of how the agriculture market works, but I'm trying to give you an intuitive feel for how this works. When I think about practical examples of perfect competition, I sometimes think about there are many relatively small firms that make nuts and bolts for industrial uses. Relatively small firms making relatively interchangeable products. Or in North Carolina and Alabama, there are a large number of fairly small companies, meaning they typically employ 50, 75, 100 people, that make socks. And they can all make many different kinds of socks, and then they sell those socks on to retailers. So they're pretty close to a perfectly competitive kind of industry. What are the key characteristics of a perfectly competitive industry? Let me run through a number of them, but in brief, they would be that they're price takers, there's lots of entry and exit in firms, profits are low, and the prices closely reflect the cost of production. Let me sort of run through those one at a time. First of all, perfectly competitive firms are price takers. What does that mean? When there are lots and lots of firms and extremely similar or identical products, each firm essentially has to accept the market price and sell at the market price. What do I mean by that? If a seller in a perfectly competitive market tried to charge even 1 penny more than the market price, it would lose all its sales to other firms. They just have to accept what the market price is because they're just too small to do anything about it. If you've got many small firms and a product that many firms can make, it's typically pretty easy for existing perfectly competitive firms to expand production or to reduce production. And since the firms are relatively small, it's usually pretty easy for new firms to start up and existing firms to close down. The combination of these traits is that profits in this industry tend to be low. Pretty much all the firms in a perfectly competitive industry make about the same profit. They all have to charge the same price. They're all producing in more or less the same way. Now, of course, firms have to earn some profit in order to continue existing. But what I really mean to say is they're earning kind of a low, normal rate of profit. Nothing special, nothing extra. When profits are very low and everyone is charging the same price, then the selling price is going to be closely linked to the cost of production. After all, if the selling price was above the cost of production, then the firms would be consistently earning profits. But the firms compete against each other and they drive down the profits. If there were firms in a highly competitive industry that were making profits, then there would be entry of more companies, an expansion of production. And as that entry occurred, it would drive down the price. Of course, if all the firms are making losses, then some firms will go out of business, and as they exit, their price will tend to rise over time. When you look at a perfectly competitive industry, you can imagine these firms that are just trying to squeeze just a couple of cents off their cost of production, so they can just try to make a little bit of profit. But with all the firms trying to squeeze their costs in this way, no one ends up making a whole lot of money. I should emphasize that truly perfect competition in the textbook sense is sort of like a perfectly pure gas in a laboratory. It's a theoretical extreme. Products are rarely identical. I mean, even stuff like wheat or corn, if you ask any farmer, they'll tell you there are many different kinds of wheat, many different kinds of corn, and they're really separate products. There are also sort of intangibles with a lot of products, like the reliability of the supply or the quality of the product. So it's very rare that products would literally be identical. But you can still think of this idea of perfect competition as a sort of benchmark, kind of like when you're in physics and they talk about a frictionless ramp. The ramps aren't really frictionless, but it's a useful way to think. And the closer you get to that extreme of an industry with lots of small firms, where the firms are producing extremely similar products, where no one can make a whole lot of money, and everyone is sort of struggling to accept the market price, the closer you are to that ideal model of perfect competition. Some people would say that certain electronics products, like, say, color televisions, not the big plasma ones, but the old-style color televisions, or computer chips, or small transistor radios, are really pretty close to perfect competition. Lots of people make them, and they sell more or less at the cost of production. Now, let's go to the opposite extreme from perfect competition. Instead of perfect competition, let's talk about monopoly. Monopoly is the situation where a single seller has all or most of the sales in a given market. Common examples. Microsoft in the late 1990s and the early 2000s dominated the market for computer operating systems. Earlier, if you go back about 2 or 3 decades, IBM once dominated the market for mainframe computers. Xerox once dominated the market for photocopying machines. The US Postal Service dominates daily letter delivery. Most people have no choice about who provides their garbage pickup or provides their electricity. Those are commonly monopolies as well. Why do monopolies exist? What's the reason that there's only one firm? Well, usually there's some barrier that prevents other firms from entering the market. Now, these barriers might be good barriers from a social point of view, or they might be bad barriers, but there's something that's stopping other firms from entering the market. And when I say good barriers or bad barriers, what I really mean to say is society getting anything in exchange for this barrier to entry? So for example, one barrier to entry is a patent. If a firm has invented something and the government gives you a patent, then that patent stops other firms from producing that specific good, at least without your approval. You're the only one who can use that invention, at least for a certain period of time. And if your firm is the only one in the industry, you will be a monopoly. You can think, for example, of a pharmaceutical company that gets a patent on the only drug to treat a certain disease. Now, we'll talk about monopolies and we'll talk about productivity more in later lectures. But basically, the argument for patents is they provide an incentive for innovation. Firms try and invent because they know they'll get a monopoly if they get a patent. And so when they get that monopoly, they'll be able to charge more and make higher profits. So a patent might be thought of in a way as a good barrier to entry. It's intended to be a barrier to entry to reward those who innovated. Other monopolies might be created by law, like say the US Postal Service, or the monopoly in most cities on who picks up garbage is created by law. A lot of cities have a local monopoly on taxi cabs in one way or another that's set by local law. So in those cases, there's sort of a question of whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's set by law in one or another. That's the barrier to entry that allows the monopoly to exist. A monopoly can also arise if all the large firms in an industry could merge together, or at least agree to act together in their decisions about pricing and what quantities to produce. For example, what would happen if Coke decided to buy Pepsi, two big firms merging together? Well, actually, that was proposed a few years back and the government wouldn't let them. Or what happens when one mega firm like Mobil wants to merge with another mega oil firm like Exxon? Well, that was proposed and the government let it go through. When business groups come together, either through an explicit merger or an implicit agreement, and they agree to work together, there's going to be less competition in that industry. The question of whether that's a good or a bad thing is then, of course, open for dispute. In the next lecture in antitrust, we'll talk about how the government decides on whether or not to allow such mergers to proceed. Yet another barrier to entry can be what's called a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly happens when the industry has economies of scale, which gives a large established firm an advantage over any new entrants. So let me give you an example of that. We talked about economies of scale before. Economies of scale is when a large firm can produce at a lower average cost. Let's imagine, for example, that the production of electricity can be done at a lower average cost in a large hydroelectric dam than in a small factory. That's not obviously true, but let's go with it for the purposes of the example. As a result, once you've built the large dam, small producers of electricity are going to find it very difficult to enter this market. And it's not going to make sense to build a second big power plant because there's not enough demand in the market to make sense there. So a natural monopoly exists in the sense when the production technology to make something tends to lead to this monopoly outcome, because one big factory can supply the entire market at lower cost than a bunch of smaller providers. What happens with monopolies? Well, they have some power to set the price above what it would otherwise be and to earn profits higher than perfectly competitive firms. A monopoly will set its price according to the elasticity of demand for its product. If demand for the product is highly inelastic, then the monopoly is going to be able to raise the price. After all, remember, if you're a monopoly and there are barriers to entry, good or bad barriers, you don't have to worry about the price set by other firms. You just choose the price yourself. But there's a trade-off. If you set the price too high, the quantity demanded of your product will drop off so much that you're not going to be selling very much. So you want to push up the price high enough so that you can make higher profits than a competitive firm, but not so high that you cause a large drop in the quantity demanded. How high can a monopoly raise its price? Well, it depends on the elasticity of demand. If demand is pretty inelastic for the product, the monopoly can raise its price quite high. And again, you might want to think about a pharmaceutical company with a monopoly on a certain drug. People are really going to pay a lot of money for that drug if it's really the only one that can work for them. The key point is that monopoly prices are going to be consistently higher than perfectly competitive prices. Monopoly is not a price taker. It doesn't have to accept the market price. It chooses the market price. And with a higher price and no entry from other firms because of those barriers to entry, a monopoly can earn consistently above average profits. I should also say that some monopolies don't have to take those profits in a monetary form. A famous economist named Sir John Hicks once said, "The best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life." The nice thing about being a monopoly is no one comes to challenge you. And so in some ways, you can just sort of relax. In a perfectly competitive market, you can't relax for a minute. This has been recognized for a long time. The great economist John Stuart Mill wrote back in 1848 that wherever competition is not, monopoly is. And monopoly in all its forms is the taxation of the industrious for the support of indolence, if not plunder. I love that phrase, if not plunder. The idea he's trying to convey is that monopoly is there to suck money away from consumers. Now, it may be a good thing, like when you're rewarding innovation. It may not be a good thing, but that's what monopoly does. On the spectrum of competition, monopolistic competition is closer to this idea of perfect competition than it is to monopoly. Monopolistic competition is when many firms compete by selling differentiated products. A differentiated product just means a product that is similar to another product but different. Think about a shopping mall with many different clothing stores. They're all competing but not identical products. You can also think about products being differentiated in a lot of different ways. The gas at gas stations is pretty similar, but some gas stations might have an especially good location at a busy corner, and that gives them a differentiation over other gas stations. You listen to advertisements, you can hear all the differentiation. Goods that are extra spicy or non-stick or have an easy-to-grip handle or long-lasting or guaranteed or have free delivery. All those kinds of things are things that people are trying to differentiate their product and make it different than similar products. In a way, monopolistic competition is a sort of a mini monopoly. Everyone can produce a similar product to you, but you're the only one who can produce your specific product. I'm from Minnesota, so I often think about the Mall of America in terms of monopolistic competition, the largest shopping mall in the United States. Last time I looked, it had 24 stores that sell women's ready-to-wear clothing. It has another 42 stores that sell clothing for both men and women, plus 12 more stores that sell women's specialty clothing like maternity clothing or lingerie. So there's this enormous number of stores that all sell clothing, but they're differentiated in certain ways. Now, like a monopoly, a monopolistically competitive firm does have some power to choose its price based on the elasticity of demand. But it doesn't have as much power to raise price as an actual monopoly. Also, a monopoly is the only firm in its industry, while a monopolistic competitor has lots and lots of competitors. So typically, a monopolistic competitor can raise its price some, but not by nearly as much as a monopoly. Also, there's no barriers to entry for monopolistic competitors. There can have more restaurants, you can have more clothing stores, you can have more gas stations. So if clothing stores are making a lot of money, or if restaurants selling barbecued ribs are really popular, there will be lots of entry of other firms making similar kinds of products. As a result of this process of entry and exit, monopolistically competitive firms can make higher than usual profits for the short run, but not in the long run. Because if they're making a lot of money, other firms will enter the same general segment that they're in. When entry catches up, then all the other restaurants or clothing stores, all those sort of close knockoff kinds of producers will start exiting, and profits will end up at the low normal levels that perfectly competitive firms have as well. But the nice thing about monopolistic competition is it gives a really strong incentive for spotting trends, for trying to make little innovations, for offering different styles and looks and features. Broadly speaking, we can call this variety. And a big unanswered question for economists is whether a free market provides the right amount of variety. I mean, most of us like a world with some variety. I wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone wore blue jeans and t-shirts and ate American cheese sandwiches on white bread every single day, even if it was more efficient, because it would all be efficient to have everyone competing to produce exactly the same product. But on the other side, is the world really a better place and are people really happier because they have hundreds of different styles of basketball shoes? It's not obvious to me. It's possible that there's too much variety in some sense. And that question of thinking about whether there's enough or too much variety is a big open question about monopolistic competition. Final category, oligopoly. An oligopoly is closer to monopoly than it is to perfect competition. But it's hard to analyze monopoly because in some cases, oligopolists compete in tough ways against each other. Let's first of all just focus on definition. An oligopoly is when a small number of firms have most or all of the revenues in a given market. You can think, for example, here about, say, Coke and Pepsi, who have most of the revenues in the soft drink market, or the two big companies that make airplanes, Boeing and Airbus. The really key question in oligopoly is, do the firms compete against each other in a really tough way? In which case the firms are sort of acting like perfect competitors, and they might end up all earning low profits. Or do the firms all collude together, and collude together in a way that lets all the firms in the market hold prices high, kind of like they're a monopoly, so they can all earn higher than normal profits over time? An oligopoly could act like a lot of competition, or an oligopoly could act more like a monopoly. Now, explicit collusion between firms is relatively rare. I mean, after all, explicit collusion between firms is illegal, as we'll talk about more in the next lecture on antitrust. But sometimes examples of explicit collusion come out anyway. Here's an example about explicit collusion from a phone tap that the U.S. Department of Justice did in 1982. I apologize in advance for the fact there's some profanity in the language, but, sometimes people talk that way. This is a phone conversation between Robert Crandall, who is president of American Airlines, and Howard Putnam, who's president of Braniff Airlines. And the two are competing against each other in the Dallas market. These two firms are an oligopoly. They sort of are an oligopoly within the Dallas market. They have most of the flights going out of Dallas. And at this time, Braniff is cutting its prices, and that's making the people at American unhappy because they're cutting the price and competing hard. So, here's their phone conversation. Crandall says, "I think it's dumb as for all right to sit here and pound the out of each other, and neither one of us is making a dime. We can both live here, and there ain't no room for Delta, but there's, no reason I can see, all right, to put both companies out of business." Putnam says, "Well?" Crandall says, "I mean, what the is the point of it?" Putnam says, "Do you have a suggestion for me?" Crandall says, "Yes, I have a suggestion for you. Raise your fares 20%. I'll raise mine the next morning." Putnam says, Crandall says, "You'll make more money, and I will too." Putnam says, "We can't talk about pricing." Crandall says, "Oh, Howard, we can talk about anything we want to talk about." Yeeks, huh? In this case, eventually it was decided that no law was broken, even though they had these guys on tape. Because, after all, no agreement was actually made to raise prices. Was there? But conversations like that caught on wiretap do make you wonder how many other conversations go on in any given year that were not recorded, and how many other times firms might get together in order to try and restrict competition. We know that it does happen from time to time. Now, when we think about this business of competition and what business leaders are likely to do or not do, what's important to remember is that business leaders, contrary to popular belief, are often the least supportive about competition. It may seem odd because we all sort of think, at least non-economists think, that business leaders should be the people who love the free market, and they should advocate free market competition. But if you think about this range of competition, which would you rather be? Would you rather be someone in a perfectly competitive firm, scrabbling and scratching desperately against many, many competitors making identical products? Or would you rather be a monopoly or an oligopoly, or at worst in a situation of monopolistic competition, where you can really have some freedom to raise price, to change your product, and perhaps to have some possibility of earning higher than normal profits over time. In general, business people are the ones who should be least in favor of competition, because heavy competition makes their lives extremely difficult. Consumers, on the other hand, should be highly in favor of more competition, because more competition is what provides the more innovative products at a lower cost and in a way where businesses are not necessarily making extreme profits. Competition is the ultimate way of favoring consumers.